All right, this video concentrates on the actual sort of things the news media does that can really influence what people think about politics and government, and again, the overall influence that media outlets can have. So, the first thing that media outlets engage in is what's called framing, and this is simply just influencing what people think about an issue by sort of like how they choose to like cover it, right? How they present the story can really make people think a certain thing. The war in Iraq and Afghanistan was a pretty good example of this. Largely, the American public was opposed to the war, especially the longer it went on. And I think one of the things you could do every night was turn it into any major news network, and you would see really like negative stories that would include like images like this, right? That really made you think pretty negatively about the actual war. Um, the old adage is that if it bleeds, it leads, or if it bleeds, it reads. And what that means is like the news media, and I don't think you need me to tell you this, tends to gravitate towards like negative controversy, sensational story, things like that. The really negative stuff is going to lead the news broadcast. The really negative stuff is going to be on the front page of a magazine or newspaper because that's what either like sells publications or drives like ratings. And in Afghanistan and Iraq and those wars, there are positive experiences too that often generally went uncovered by news media outlets. And if you were just depending on the news media to sort of influence your opinion about what was going on there, you were determined to come away with pretty negative like viewpoint, right? Because the positive stories weren't really given as much attention. Abington's a great example of this. Probably 7 or 8 years ago, there were a string of fights that were caught on cell phones in the high school. And these were sent out to like news media outlets, and the news media chose to sort of like paint Abington as like a lawless school where people just walked down the hallway and just like fought each other all the time. And clearly we know that wasn't the case. And like, 99.9% of the Abington student bodies never gets involved in stuff like this. And does like a million awesome things on a daily basis that the news media just chooses not to cover. So by focusing on this negative, someone on the outside doesn't know about all the good stuff, just begins to have this negative connotation of like Abington students and staff, right? So how they choose to cover something really has an influence over what people think about that issue or topic. Or the idea of the media serving as like a gatekeeper or agenda setter. This is simply like the media determines what issues people care about and what's important and what's not, just based on what they choose to cover. If it's covered, it must be important. If it's not covered, then it must not be important. And this is a little outdated, this slide, but if you look back to the 2016 election, it shows you of all the Republicans that were like running for president back in 2016, the colossal advantage that Trump had because he absorbed most of the media coverage. And it's no surprise why. I mean, he was the most outspoken, the most interested, the most controversial. And think about it, if you're getting like that much more media attention than your opponents, the advantage that gives you. Or when you got to the general election in 2016, I mean, Trump was covered for almost 2,000 minutes on ABC, CBS, and NBC news programs. Clinton a little over 1,000 minutes, and then the third party candidates less than a minute in like totality between all three of them. And think about how that translates to the average citizen. Oh well, the media's not covering you, so you're not important. And again, this happens a lot. Or if you just look at this map is, blue dots represent an area that was covered on major U.S. news networks at least 5 times between 2009 and 2019. And no surprise that most of the areas talked about on U.S. news broadcasts are like Europe and the United States, and very little in other areas. In fact, despite the fact that they account for like billions of people, no U.S. media networks have bureaus in South America, India, or Africa. And they're obviously, if you look at the blue dots, not really covered all that much in the news either. So, like, what impact does that have? Well, it leads Americans to think that those areas aren't important, that those people that live in those areas aren't important, and think about politically the impact that has. Like, something happens, the United States, is trying to help one of these areas, and oftentimes public opinion is opposed to it because you're predisposition to think that these areas aren't important and they're not significant. So that's agenda keeping or sort of being agenda setting or gatekeeping. Um, the news media also engages in what's called horse race journalism. We talked about this a little bit when we did the election stuff earlier in the year. This is the idea that less and less are news media sources covering the differences between candidates and elections. They just focus on like the sport of the actual campaign. Who's winning, who's losing, who's up in the polls, who's down in the polls. And there's definitely less focus on sort of like the differences between the candidates and just more on the actual like election race itself. So people become more interested in polls and like less interested in the actual like issues. Another sort of like trend with media outlets is this like sort of movement towards what I call infotainment. And this is the idea that no longer are news media outlets in the business of sort of like educating you about an issue. They're just trying to like entertain you, right, through news. It started with sports, where you saw like the two talking heads sort of like yelling back and forth each other about a topic such as this.
I mean, like, so was Carson Wentz? Does he deserve credit for winning 3 games? Sure, he deserves some of the credit for that. Is he an all-world talent? No question. I never said otherwise. That's why my standards for him are high. But to crow today, like I assume someone's about to do, based on what we just saw, tells you how low the bar has fallen for Carson Wentz.
This is the weakest argument you've presented in this situation.
All right, so I'm not going to show you more of that, but like that's what this has become. Like with sports, it's like these hot takes where you have two people that just like argue back and forth and say outlandish things, and then that has gradually spilled over into politics.
So just on this point of that the president's not a big foreign aid guy, and that's absolutely true. He's also not really a big anti-corruption guy. That hasn't been a big priority of his. One thing we learned today is that he never raised in previous calls the issue of corruption, and even in the call that he had on the 25th, the only things he raised were crowdsource and the Biden. So it kind of begs the question: is he really concerned about corruption in Ukraine, or is he concerned about these political?
Right. Volker was asked about Russia, about Saudi Arabia, about Turkey, and obviously the president of Turkey just visited the White House.
And it's really like the same format, right? It's just like one person thinks one way, one person thinks the other. You just argue back and forth, and it's more about entertainment. You also have more focus on like soft news, which is like the more sensational stuff, like the scandals, like the controversies, and less about what we call hard news, which is like in-depth analysis of like issues and political like differences. And then the last thing is the idea of like narrow casting and bias. And this is that like news media outlets don't even really cover it up anymore. They're just broadcasting, they're not broadcasting, like they're not like sending their message out to like the broad community. They're narrowly focusing their message to like for Fox conservatives and for CNN like liberals, and that you could argue this is a very biased sort of like approach, right? And this is a great example about how you can have two competing media outlets have very different takes on really like the same issue or event.
Thank you. God bless you, and God bless America.
Case, I think, closed.
I thought it was sort of generic. She really didn't say that much that was interesting.
That could not have gone better for them. That could not have gone better for them.
It wasn't a great speech, but she delivered it very well, and she came across as extremely attractive.
If that speech was to be more about tone than content, pitch perfect. It was supposed to be more about content than tone. Pitch perfect.
It was a very liberal speech. There was one reference to soldiers who defend their country.
There was a reference to "they love this country," meaning the troops. There was another one to "I love this country." There were 6 references to country.
The heroes of Michelle Obama's world are people who march.
Not everybody's going to be taken with this charm offensive.
They're so concerned to get away from this elitist attack that the McCain campaign has launched that she never mentioned the colleges she and her husband went to or the law school they both went to, all of which are Ivy League schools.
I'm taken with it. I am very proud of my country tonight.
Michelle Obama looked just beautiful, but I can't help but feel after this first night of the convention that it was a largely wasted night.
I know. I'm beginning to sound borderline sycophantic on this.
His wife loves him, although, you know, in a court of law, that's usually discounted by the jury.
Yeah, case closed.
Again, it's like coverage of Michelle Obama's speech back several years ago during the Democratic convention that nominated her husband, Barack Obama. But depending on if you watch Fox or MSNBC, you got a completely different coverage of the event because they're narrow casting to a particular audience that wants to hear a certain message.